at some of the market outlook data. So I'll leave this up here, but for the time being, the sense that I'm getting from a lot of our clients and from everyone that we're working with is that we're all really experiencing rising interest rates, the cost of living crisis really impacting in the way that people are now looking to actually buy new jobs. So the way that candidates are engaging with us is really changing also in the post-pandemic. Certainly from our research, what we're finding is that candidates are looking for way more work-life balance. They're looking for opportunities to progress. They're looking to mitigate risk. They're looking for security. They're looking for better work-life balance. So the way that they're engaging with roles is really, really changing. And it's not the traditional recruitment process that we'd have seen in the past. What we're also seeing in the market is that this, coupled with a lot of clients actually increasing counter offers, is really changing the way salaries are increasing and is having a real impact on recruitment. If just take a moment actually to look at the CIPD market outlook, there's some really interesting data around what HR professionals are finding. This piece of research actually surveys around 2,000 HR professionals in the UK, where we can see that 38% of employers are finding that they have very hard to fill vacancies. So we're finding that those employers are still, about 62% of them are still expecting to have more recruitment actually over the next 3 months. But also what we're seeing is that a lot of people in the past 12 months, probably around 40% of those surveys, are making more and more counter offers to hold on to people, to avoid having to go out there, to avoid having to go and recruit and pay more costs. And what we're actually seeing is that most of them are giving counter offers way above the salaries that are offered, and 38% of those are actually matching salaries. So we can really see with the market dynamics of the way that candidates are changing, the way that they're actually buying jobs and the counter offers, how the market's actually driving up salaries and some of the challenges. If we then couple that with some industry data, education, construction, transport, manufacturing, healthcare appearing on some of the higher end of the list of where we're finding that there's harder to fill vacancies. So we can see why people are really suffering, challenging, and how this is driving behaviours. And then again, if we couple that with further data, when we look at what people are expecting around whether they'll have future hiring vacancies, we're also seeing some of those same sectors actually appearing on those lists, which is very, very interesting to hear. With these changes, one of the things that we can do with clients is start to look at how we use data to actually inform decision making, because some of the metrics that historically we've used, so for example, experience equals this level of salary, just doesn't fit anymore. So we're having to be really considered in how we use the data to inform our recruitment processes at the front end. What I thought would be really useful is to talk you through 2 case studies on this. One with a client of ours, actually also in healthcare, which I'll talk you through. That client actually used the data at the front end of the recruitment process. And then I'll hand over to Rob to talk through a really lovely project that we worked on, and he used the data actually throughout the process. So a little bit of introduction to a lovely client of ours who is in healthcare, multi-site, national organisation, has a huge amount of challenges. They're actually not-for-profit, so salary is a major concern for them because they have to absolutely keep in tight budgets. One of the examples I'll give you is actually on their health and safety division. The client had realised that they wanted to change their structure, recognising that health and safety was a key part of their future strategy. They also recognised that the role that they were looking to change, which was a group health and safety manager role, is something that was outdated. They wanted more collaboration. They wanted this person to bring in better practices into the organisation. But they were actually really unsure of the structure that they needed to take going forward. They weren't quite sure of the exact role profile. They knew that this would be a hard to recruit role because they've had challenges in recruiting advisors. They also had no idea of what the salary implications would be for this role because they hadn't actually recruited the role previously. They've had somebody historic in there, and they also know that they needed to change the culture. So they had a number of challenges that they were facing. They had questions that they needed to answer. So they really wanted to know what roles existed out there that would align with their future structure, what would be their obstacles in terms of hiring, because we knew that this could potentially have a real impact on whether they could even hire or the salaries. They also wanted to know what candidates being remunerated in healthcare because they wanted to stay very specific to their industry. They also wanted to know what would motivate candidates to actually join them and whether they could actually find any talent out there that would fit their desired budget. So they wanted to know all of this before they actually started to restructure and engage with candidates. Now, what was really helpful is that we undertook some really deep research into the markets, very specific to them, very specific to their brief. They were actually able to identify that there were some huge gaps between what the external talent landscape was able to offer them and what the role profile was internally. One of the big challenges was that within health and safety on this occasion, there was a huge amounts of heads of, but they always had advisors reporting into them. So there was a real gap in terms of group health and safety manager candidates out there. We're also identifying that there's a real aging population, and actually the feedback was that everybody else was having some real challenges in recruitment. What they were able to do off the back of the research is really understand that in order to bring in a profile, they would probably find this person in a much larger organisation as a regional health and safety manager who would then need to take the step up, but wasn't at head of level or certainly at group manager level. Or they would have to look for a head of in a smaller organisation or within the NHS. So they knew where a potential candidate could come from. They were then able to actually couple that data with really understanding what people were getting paid. So recognizing that health and safety managers were ranging somewhere between 45 to 60,000, plus there were some additional benefits on that. But really their desires were to start to take a jump up to 65,000 on base salary. And actually, when we looked at the data, head of salaries were barely starting at 65,000, but they were actually probably more broadly 75 to 80,000 upwards for some candidates. The other thing that they were able to identify is actually the candidate motivators. So this was a relatively passive candidate market. Candidates that were actually going to make the move were really thinking about how am I going to progress? What are the opportunities? Am I going to get to head of role? Are you innovating? And so in this client's case, they were able to understand what candidates were looking for beyond the salary. So with all of this data, they obviously went away, had some fantastic internal conversations, and they had some really strong outcomes. Some of those things were around actually realigning their internal expectations. So knowing that they had a really tight budget that they couldn't break, which in their case was 65 being the upper limit with some additional benefits, what they were able to do is have some really strong internal dialogue with key decision makers, CEO, risk directors, and decide that they were going to compromise on some elements of the role in order to keep in the budget. But knowing the talent market, they recognised that probably the only area that they could compromise on would be leadership. So that meant that they could actually dip into the talent pool at a slightly lower level and take time to develop somebody who's perhaps in a regional role that understood their market, understood their challenges, but they could be coached and developed. Now, in terms of what they then also used the data to do is they actually created a really attractive role profile. So to keep engagement high, to get more diverse candidates applying, we wanted to make sure the actual role profile itself spoke to candidates in terms of the role responsibilities, what they would be doing, but also outlining actually what the future progression opportunities would be in the company. We're also able to decide on the role being remote working because the data showed that these candidates lived all over the UK and they had the opportunity to set up the role being multi-site so that this candidate wasn't tied to the location. And they also align their package to the market, being able to go out there based on the data with a really strong understanding of where not only the base salary, but what are the benefits people are coming back with. So what were they competing against? Once they were ready to go and everybody was aligned on all of these aspects, they were actually able to then go into the research and use the research to shortlist candidates, which really allowed them to minimise their time to hire, allowing them to literally engage with candidates straight away and move forward with some really, really suitable candidates to interview and not lose out on anybody. And the final thing that they used the data to do was actually really considering their candidate journey. So thinking about candidate motivators, thinking about what feedback they got, whether candidates were even really aware of them. They were able to design a three-stage process which introduced candidates to more than just competency questions or interviews. It was about engaging with the culture, with people, the site, so that they had a really strong view of what they would actually join. And ultimately, the outcome of that is that they were actually able to keep in budget and attract a candidate relatively quickly into the organisation. Now, Rob and I worked on a really fantastic project actually at a time where practice managers were a really difficult, just difficult land space for you to be hiring from. I think from memory, Rob, you had some challenges in terms of bringing in a new level of candidate, really upskilling, upgrading those individuals. And you were also experiencing some challenges from stakeholders around taking people outside of industry and also around resistance to increasing salaries. So I'm going to hand over to you in a moment to talk about that, but we also wanted to just reflect on whether you in the audience find it a challenge to get stakeholders to think about taking candidates from different industries and focus on skills rather than on industry. So I'm just going to give you all a moment and then hand over to Rob to talk us through this.
So it should be coming up for you now. I believe you can only see the results once we share them if you have voted. So it is important that you all vote. We'll talk through them as well for you.
I'm going to apologise. I can't for some reason see the results on my end. So you might have to help and comment on that for me, Rob, because it's not coming up on my side.
Are you able to vote, Reka?
It just wasn't working, but I'll have a look at it in a moment.
Okay. It might be with the share of the screen as well, might be a little bit tricky.
Should I hand over to you, Rob?
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, it was a really interesting project. At the time, I was working for a fantastic multi-site healthcare business. We operated around about 700 different practices, and we really struggled, interesting for the two main reasons at the beginning of the survey. So there was a lack of diversity of candidates, and there was just a lack of the type of skills that we were looking for. And the history of this was that the company very, very rigidly stuck to recruiting people with the exact skill set from the exact same industry. So what we used RJA for was to help us understand which other organizations or sectors and role types would have similar jobs, job profiles. They may not be from within healthcare, but actually the skills are very, very similar. And we use that data to great effect. So effectively, we were able to identify lots of other types of roles which had similar communication, customer service type skills, organizational leadership skills. And then we were able to work with Reka to specifically target that profile of individual. And what that resulted in was a much better fit to the business and also a much improved cost per hire as well. So it had a few different benefits. There were, of course, some learns along the way. So what we found was when we recruited out of healthcare, we needed to really increase that level of training within the induction. So people really were able to deliver great levels of patient care, which is a slight different to customer care. Really, once we'd managed to get that resolved, we found that these individuals had a much better level of commercial thinking, could really impact the business positively. And we also found that they stayed with us for longer. So yeah, it was a really successful project, Reka.
Yeah, and I think what was really interesting when we worked together was some of the conversations with hiring managers. So we often utilised our briefing calls. We would go on to the briefing calls having done a little bit of market research specifically on that role. So for example, if it was Bristol practice manager, we would research that local area, look for people in the competitive landscape in the same industry, and then look at a broader skill set. And when we were going on to calls, we were really using the data to work with the actual hiring managers to consider what we would find, why we might have shortages, why, what the size of the talent pool might be. Were there industry candidates there? Were people able to, travel to where they were in terms of their sites? So actually allow the process to flow quite well, because decision makers had a lot of the data at the front end, and were able to manage their expectations quite easily. So I don't know if you've got any other comments on that, Rob, and what you found.
Yeah, I think, for me, a top tip for anybody that's looking to do this is to really get high levels of buy-in from those senior operational stakeholders early in the process. So the technique that I always use is to really get to their specific commercial pain point. And then once I've got them to that pain point, really start to influence them to try and think more broadly, and be willing to compromise that, yes, okay, so we might bring somebody in from, outside of healthcare who arguably won't hit the ground running as quickly, but this individual, we can get them running quickly and they're going to stay with us for longer, and actually they're going to deliver a better job commercially. I think that really, really helped focus minds, but I can't stress enough the importance of taking those stakeholders on the journey with you, and then continually using the data to reinforce back to the stakeholders that actually, these people are working to a better standard than the previous ones.
Yeah, and I think it also really supported with time to hire, because that was often a challenge with decision makers. They would take quite a long time to actually recognise and realise that they maybe needed to go back to market to find a different candidate. So instead of going through a really long process of taking stakeholders on a journey with you over months, we sort of fast forwarded that, used the data at the front end, and then would go through the actual candidate journey with them a lot smoother. Now, one of the things that also ties into this really, really well is around brand perception and engagement. So, again, very geographically working with you, Rob, one of the things that we did is actually feedback on what people thought of my dentist. What was the perception? And this was really interesting from industry candidates and people in competitions, because, and not just with yourself, but with a lot of clients that we work with, everybody has challenges around brand perception and engagement, whether that is a historical challenge. I know in my dentist case, it was the fact that you'd gone through such a large scale acquisition 10 years ago that had less some legacy issues. But for some other clients, it might be the industry that they work within, for example, gaming and betting. And for some clients we work with, they just are, candidates just aren't aware of them. So there's a real lack of brand perception and engagement. And again, you can use this data to really help you understand what the market's saying about you. But I just wanted to reflect on a moment as to why that's really important and how that's really affecting salaries. Because what we're finding at the moment is there's more counter offers, candidates are buying jobs differently. If somebody has a slightly poorer, employer brand or engagement with the candidate market, we're generally finding that candidates are using compensation as compensation for that. So if someone's perceived poorly, they want it to be compensated more, or they want to use compensation as validation that that employer is actually someone that they should actually go and join. And on some occasions, they want increased salaries because they perceive that perhaps their career might be limited by joining an organisation. There might be less progression. So the stronger the employer brand can be and the stronger the engagement, it can really benefit us. And actually, if you look at some of the data around this, we're seeing that employers with a really strong brand are spending less on hires by about 43%. They're also finding it much quicker to recruit people by reducing time to hire by about 50%, but it's also affecting their retention rates, which ultimately really helps with reducing your costs in terms of hiring. And also they're seeing much better qualified candidates actually going out there and applying to their job roles. So that also then affects basically their time to hire and the opportunity to attract better candidates and keep their retention. Now, again, going back to this comment that I made to you earlier on, Rob, about how we use the data, I just wanted to get your views on what you found when we were feeding back around market perceptions, around the perception of my dentist, around maybe some of the candidate journeys that people were feeding back on, and how you use that data to change your strategy internally.
Sure. I mean, the data was really, really helpful to help lots of different elements of the strategy. So first of all, we were finding that the processes were just too long and too lengthy and too time consuming and onerous for a lot of the candidates. So that helped us identify where we needed to streamline those processes and really shift the focus over to candidate experience. I mean, we live in the world of Indeed one click or reply, you know, whether we like it or not, and that sets an industry benchmark really for how quickly people expect to move through processes. So that was really helpful. The insight around pay scales was also really helpful. So we were able to introduce a more dynamic approach to pay, giving location allowances at different ratings when it was necessary. And we were able to implement that in quite a structured way through partnering with our finance and commercial team. So again, we were able to have a very measured impact on the business. And then we were also able to feed the outputs of that data into our employer brand messaging in the way we advertised our roles. So again, you know, to sort of reiterate what Reka was saying before, I think you have to have a blended approach where you do need to have a solid employer brand proposition, a clear purpose, a clear value set, and a clear culture. It's particularly important for certain demographics. So you'll find that Gen Zs and millennials will be really, really drawn to this. And again, it can help reduce your cost per hire and increase retention, because if you're only attracting people on the basis of salary, you know, as soon as they get offered 5 or 10p more an hour, they're going to be off down the road. So if you can really shift the messaging focus over to purpose and return, you're going to find a bigger fit or a better fit of people. The other thing that I would also recommend is influencing the business to be more open-minded to different age profiles. So there's lots of people that may have retired from a primary career and looking to move into a secondary career that have got fantastic skills. And, you know, people that are really a lot more mature can be fantastic assets that generally have much higher retention rates. So all of that data fed into all of those different decisions and all positively impacted what we were doing.
Yeah, and I think just to comment on that, what was really interesting is when we first started the project with you, different regions had different ways of recruiting. There wasn't real consistency. So somebody might literally have a Teams interview, come in and meet us, then go and visit a site, then go and do a presentation. And some people would do a two-stage interview. So we were really able to influence your decision makers along the way with actually helping them understand why they were losing candidates from the process and bring everybody together. So it wasn't just sort of high level data within the actual HR function. It was actually working with area managers and regional managers to help them understand why they needed to be more consistent in the way that they worked. Did you find that they had sort of any frustrations, challenges when we were doing this? Was there anything that was particularly helpful?
I think having the data allowed us to have a more commercially focused conversation. So you were able to keep steering the conversation around to how it was benefiting their P&L, whereby when you're working without that data, it can often be a much harder, you know, influencing job. So having that data at every stage allowed us to really root those conversations in commercial impact. And obviously that's going to have a much better way of getting the attention of your exec team. And it's also going to help you really engage your operational leaders too. I think post-recruitment, we kept a very close eye on how well the new recruits were performing compared to benchmark candidates that may have come from within the same sector. And in nearly every instance, we found that the new recruits were outperforming the previous recruits. So we had a constant ongoing feedback loop and worked very closely with our learning and development team to make sure any skills gaps or experience gaps were being picked up through induction and ongoing training. So yeah, those things definitely helped.
Yeah, and also what was really nice to notice throughout the project is the way that you and your team started to really engage with candidates on your social channels. So you had some really great interviews with different practice managers. Like all of a sudden, the way that you were talking about your roles had really started to change on various different channels. And if memory serves me right, it also prompted the organisations to consider hiring a marketeer that was purely focused on recruitment.
Yeah, that's right. So we went to very much an ambassador-led approach to our recruitment advertising. So we would identify, you know, key opinion leaders and fantastic team members who were willing to go on camera, and we would use them to share their authentic experience, which we could then post on social media and amplify that according to specific geographies or types of profiles that we were looking to attract. And yeah, we had a fantastic colleague, Rosa O'Byrne, who did a brilliant job of managing the attraction and employer brand. We also did quite a significant project with SMRS, who are an incredible employer brand and advertising agency who I've worked with for many years. So a combination really of some external expertise and some heavyweight expertise from SMRS. And then, like I say, a fantastic in-house colleague, Rosa, who really helped us drive and implement the brand.
Well, thank you for sharing those details. Um, and within that, we've already touched a little bit upon this because you talked around the fact that you wanted to really increase the diversity of your talent pool because we weren't just looking for industry hires. But I wanted to, again, just get a feel for whether you're out there seeing any benefits from attracting a diverse talent pools for your jobs. Are you finding that, the diversity is helping you move your candidate pipeline forward? Are you finding any benefits along the way, or not at all? Or is it just on occasions it is? And sometimes it isn't. And again, Rob, you might have to help me with this if I can't see the poll and tell me what comes back. Just give you all a
Yeah, I
moment
think
to have
people
a
are still
look.
voting.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
I'll give it 30 seconds or so for people to select their vote, and then I'm happy to read it out.
Just whilst you do that, I'll start to slowly introduce, I suppose, the one of the big things that a lot of people have actually asked around around diversity and inclusion. For us, this has been really a key part of all the research elements that we've talked around this and some of the clients that we work with, because the more diverse and the more inclusive we can be with our talent pipelining, the more it actually helps you support your managing your salaries and managing basically the levels of competition when it comes to your roles. Ultimately, if we can bring in more talent into your pipeline from different ages, sexes, backgrounds, educational backgrounds, different skills, different cultural backgrounds, the more competitive your jobs ultimately become, the more talent you can engage with, the more you can actually consider different ways of fulfilling your needs in the organisation. And ultimately, what we're also finding is that the more diverse an organisation is and the more inclusive they are, it really, really influences the way that they're perceived out there by candidates. So that ties back into what we talked around brand engagement. So I don't know if you've got some results. I'd be really interested to hear what's come back.
Yeah, I think 54% agreed. 6% said no, they're not seeing the benefit, and 40% said sometimes they're seeing the benefit.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. So I think there are definitely some challenges in the way people engage with the talent pool. So I'm just going to use for a moment and refer back to the original health and safety case study and the way that that actually helped diversify their talent pool. Just to give you some figures, we had around 62 actual potential profiles that we spoke with who were part of a broader talent map, but actually these were the people that had the right desired skill set for the client for the group health and safety role. Ultimately, the talent pool did tell us and the data did tell us that traditionally it is a male aging population. But what we were able to do by having a really thorough research element to the way that we actually researched the market is bringing a lot more female talent. So they actually made up 35% of the talent pool. Interestingly, there was only 7% of the talent pool that came from a different cultural background. And I think that's just representative of that function and the way health and safety has grown up in healthcare. And what we're able to identify is that the client was able to see that male candidates were getting paid around about £10,000 more on their base salary. So what the client was able to do in this instance is actually make sure that the initial candidates that were coming into conversations were really diverse, and they took people through obviously a really strong candidate journey. Their actual final two candidates were female, and that was very much based on actually the way that they would approach the job role, how they fit the culture, and they ultimately ended up benefiting from having a more diverse talent pool by not worrying about having to pay £10,000, £15,000 over the odds to potentially get a candidate that would come through their normal selection process. So they were actually able to stay within budget. But what they were also able to do is to really understand what the feedback was from the candidates. What is it that they needed from the employer to be able to come on board? So, for example, for a lot of the female candidates, they were primary carers at home, they might have been a single parent. So, hence, the remote working was really important, giving them flexibility. And the clients then being able to go away and consider how else can they make their future roles be really attractive and be really engaging with different candidates from different backgrounds, different situations in order to help their diversity. So if that's part of the agenda, it's really important to actually engage with candidates on quite a localized level and to get true feedback, even just in terms of whether they're aware of you, what their main considerations might be, where are they shopping, where are they going to buy these roles, so where will you be able to find them in the future, so you can really tweak the way that you actually go out there and engage them from your own platforms. Any thoughts on that, Rob, from your experience? Anything else to share?
No, not really. I just agree. I think, for me, the diversity thing is about, you've got to be really, really clear on what your goals are there. And I think, going back to the pain points of your operational leaders or HR leaders, somebody asked a really good question earlier on, which is about, what if the hiring managers don't mind about time to hire? Well, what we've got to find out, what is their primary concern. So if it's not time to hire, is it quality of hire? Is it cost per hire? As leaders, we've got to understand what is this open position actually doing to affect their business, and then design our influencing strategy around that specific pain point. And also now trying to be more innovative than just look at cost, quality and time, and look at things like candidate experience, diversity scorecards, strength of pipeline, future pipeline percentage mixes, all those sorts of things now can again help us structure solid commercial arguments to take a more insight-led approach.
Brilliant. And I think now, as we come to close, we'll probably recap for you in terms of what our recommendations would be together, Rob and I, our recommendations on sort of some short-term strategies. So for me, wherever possible, and the more you can use your data to inform your decisions, the better. It's going to ultimately help shorten your timelines, better influence. It takes you away from gut feelings and historics and allows you to actually make a real impact in the way that you recruit. Use your data and use whatever information you have to definitely consider the much broader, proposition. It's not just about salary, and we see that in the way that candidates are actually engaging with job roles and what they're feeding back to us. With regards to your advertising, the more transparent you can be, the more inspiring you can be, the more you can engage with the language of what candidates are looking for. And I think, be transparent about what you can offer, not just salary, because actually, and doing some of the research, we're not necessarily finding that having a higher salary bracket is necessarily attracting a better quality of candidate. Often it can be more about the messaging. It could be actually what the store is, what the progression is. There could be some issues around brand perception that you want to really tackle in the way that you're communicating with people. So really consider what it is that candidates really want to hear from you. Again, linking back into diverse talent pools, the more you can diversify the people that you're engaging with, look at your challenges. Could we potentially make the roles remote? Could we maybe make this a role a shared role, because we've got a really strong talent pool of candidates who are part-timers that want to do this. You can actually really start to think about how you can manage your cost and create diversification. The candidate journey is key, engagement is key. I know a lot of people are keen on AI and automation, and it is important to help, buy you back capacity internally. But we're definitely finding that with hard to recruit roles and where there are challenges, engagement is key. This is where you can use your teams, your branding, and just the way that you engage with candidates to really get them past the conversation around salaries and get them to engage with you and your culture. And again, this ties into the way that you influence candidates. So the more you can equip your recruiters to help them actually get into the candidate motivators, to train them on having the conversations away from salaries, will allow you in the short term to really have an impact on that. Rob, have I missed anything?
No, I don't think so. I think it's pretty comprehensive.
Right. And then for the long term, our recommendations would be, again, going back to looking at how you can diversify your talent pool. And we appreciate, and Rob, you'll know this better than me, there are some challenges sometimes around the way people perceive hiring, for example, shared roles or part-timers or remote roles. So that requires a lot of data and influencing. But again, if you can also consider how you're building your employer branding from day one and your engagement around that as well, the way that you're talking on social channels, the way that you're using your ATS, that will all tie into helping build your brand, build your candidate pool, and build that indoctrination into you as an organisation, messaging around what you can offer them, your culture, your people, and being really clever and creative. And again, tying that away from just salaries and just opportunities. And then the final would be the more you can do around retention, the better long term. And perhaps that last one is better explained by Rob than myself, being in-house.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, lots of organizations now really see the value of retention as well as recruitment. And a lot of the conversations I have with clients, both here and in the US, is, where does a retention issue begin and where does a recruitment issue begin? Often the reason, you've got high turnover is because of cultural issues, or it may be that actually you're not looking after your staff in the right way. So really, unless you fix those core issues around your proposition and culture, recruitment is only going to serve as a revolving door. So definitely using a lot more data, employee surveys, engagement surveys to really understand what are the issues around high turnover and attrition and what can be done to affect that in a positive way. The other point that I wanted to just build on, Reka, from something you said earlier, is that diverse talent pools as well, we're seeing a big trend towards fractional working. So previously, where one of my clients might have said, we need one full-time person. If there isn't one full-time person available with that skill set or that market, what can we do to maybe get 2 or 3 people in to fill that responsibility in more of a fractional way of working? So again, that can really have a huge transformational impact on the way you resource your business if you're able to influence your stakeholders to think outside the box in that way. So that's something else that I'm definitely seeing more of.
Thank you. And I think for me, that probably concludes all of that. So thank you for sharing your thoughts. And